Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Title IX Resources Subcommittee discussion of the Title IX survey. As we're getting started, there are a couple of points I wanted to share before we get going. And with that, well, first of all, we'll do an introduction of the individuals that are on the Title IX Resources Subcommittee. So first, in regards to the members of the Title IX Resources Subcommittee, have Dr. Jacqueline White.
Hi, everybody.
We have Julie Varnum, who has stepped away from her computer very quickly, but she is the Assistant Superintendent for Student Support Services. Mr. Patrick McCarty, Principal at Ashland High School. I don't believe he is on the call today. Of course, we have Miss Stephanie Craybill. And then we have also Miss Stephanie Walker. Miss Crable and Miss Walker, of course, are New Hampshire County School Board members. In addition to the subcommittee resources members, we have Miss Amy Feast, who I believe is trying to get on at the moment. She is on already?
I'm here, yeah.
Okay.
Hi, everyone.
And we have Miss Amy Oots, who is also present with us. So those are the members of the actual resources subcommittee. So we also have some additional guests with us this afternoon that we would call subject matter experts, essentially. And there we have Miss Kathy Spivey, who is here representing Department of Social Services. Miss Tanya Jordan, who is lead school counselor in New Hampshire County Schools. We have Chelsea Kroom, Miss Chelsea Kroom from Coastal Horizons. Jennifer Tucker from New Hampshire County Schools Family Life Education. We have Miss Bernice Johnson. Is she on the call? Soon? Okay.
I am.
Okay. So she is providing expertise in the role of a parent and her involvement with the PTA. And we also have Andrea Stowe from the Domestic Violence Shelter. Is she on as well? Okay, so she's not here at the moment. And then we have Miss Jen.
I don't know if she's here, but sorry, I don't know if Andrew is able to make it, but I'm here from Domestic Violence Shelter and Services.
Okay, I'm sorry, I can't see who's. Jenna Young, okay. All right. And we have Miss Jen Vanderminden, who is a professor of sociology at UNCW. So when it comes to how we will move forward today, of course, the resources subcommittee has to make some decisions on moving forward with the survey. How we will do that is through a simple majority when it comes time to vote. It will be a simple majority for the decision of the resources subcommittee, and it will be the 7 members that will be the ones that have the voting power, the experts that we've invited as subject matter experts. Will be able to provide their insight. We won't ask them their opinion of whether that we should or should not. They'll just be able to provide insight based on their expertise, and but they won't have any voting power. And so also we do have to cut off today at 4:30. If there are, if we're not complete with our discussions, then we will parking lot it and we'll have to reconvene a meeting in the very near future. So that's all I have for opening points. And we'll go ahead and get started with the survey discussion. With the survey discussion, I asked everyone to provide their insights and a couple points that they had regarding the Title IX survey. And so I'll open the floor to discussions about points that individuals want to share about the Title IX survey in general.
Okay. You want me to talk first, Gerald?
I can't see who that was.
Oh,
but,
Jackie.
Okay, yes, you can start.
Yeah,
Jackie, can I interrupt for just 1 minute?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I would like, if we could, well, I guess these points we're talking about what our goals are, because before we get way into the discussion, I wanted to make sure that we were all clear on what our goal for this survey was. So when you're giving your talking points, will you please indicate what you think the goal of this survey is, so we can at least all be on the same page about that?
Right. That's exactly what I did. I actually wrote out something and sent it to Jarrell this morning, and I would have liked to have emailed it to all of you, but I didn't know who was going to be on the call. And yeah, Stephanie, that's exactly what I was thinking about, was the specific objectives of the survey. And in my mind, I came up with 4 specific purposes. The first one is, I think really it's almost a PR thing, but we want to communicate to various audiences, and that includes the students, parents, faculty, staff, administrators, as well as the general community, that we are really committed to addressing the problem of sexual harassment and bullying in the schools. We have a commitment to move forward. And so I see this survey as a really important launching pad for doing that, so that everybody knows that the school system is interested in having responsive remedies when there's a problem, working on interventions to work with students, as well as ultimately prevention kinds of things. I think the second goal of the survey is to assess climate. And when I think of climate, I think of 2 things. It has to do with both what is actually going on. So asking the students what kinds of experiences that they are having and what they know about the policies and procedures, so that if something happens, they know what to do. The second piece of climate, in addition to knowing what's actually going on and what people know, is their perceptions. And this really ties into the issue of trust. How bad do people think the situation is, and do they actually trust the policies and procedures that are in place? Because it doesn't matter how good the policies and procedures are, if people don't trust them, it won't accomplish anything. I also think that in terms of constructing the survey, that we need to make 2 things really clear that came up in the last discussion we had, is we want to make it really clear that the survey is not a reporting mechanism. And we want to include in the survey some information that if you do want to report something, here are the appropriate avenues that you have for making reporting. And then I also think that we want to make sure that we provide a hotline, a 24/7 hotline number, so that if anybody really needs to talk about issues immediately, day or night, that they can call that number and get some immediate help. And that obviously whoever is on the other end of the phone knows about the survey and is not taken by surprise if they get a call prompted by the survey. So anyway, those are my main things. If we could accomplish that, that would be great. And the other thing that I did do, I'll just mention, is I went through all the copies of the surveys that Jarrell sent us to try to figure out what the changes were from one draft to the next, which I hope we can get some clarification on.
Thank you, Jackie.
All right, so anyone else that wants to take the floor, talk about their goals from the survey, their 3 points?
I think we need to include some kind of program evaluation information to make sure that we are, because we've put a lot of things in place. There's been a lot of great work done. And so I want to make sure that we're following up on program evaluation and then program planning.
What do you mean by program planning, Amy? Like to continue the good stuff or start other good stuff?
Right.
Okay.
Frequency of lessons, or, changing groups, make sure that we're making sure that the great things that we're already doing, we're seeing the outcomes of.
Great, thanks.
Are there others that want to share their points?
I'm sorry, I'm in the car, so I can't turn my video on, but I just wanted to point out that I can't speak for the programs that are being implemented by school staff, but those that have been implemented by like the Shifting Boundaries program and the Bringing in the Bystander program, we do evaluate those programs. So we do surveys around those programs as part of that.
I'm sorry, tell me who this was that was speaking. I don't recognize your voice.
It's
Is Jenna?
Jenna Young from
I
Domestic Violence Shelter Services.
Right, that's what I thought you were. Thanks, Jenna.
All right, is there anyone else that wants to share their points of and goals for this survey here? All
Could I
right.
add one more thing if nobody else has any other points? I think what Amy said was really important. And one of the things that we talked about at early on in one of our resource committees meetings is that we don't see this survey as a one-off. And so we might consider not trying to accomplish all the goals in the first survey. One of the things we spent a lot of time talking about is the length of the survey. And we were at the one point leaning towards a survey that was relatively short so that we actually got a lot of people to complete it. Because the longer it gets, the greater the chances of people just stopping doing it. And so we talked about this possibly as a preliminary survey to get some baseline information with the anticipation that down the road we would continue to periodically do surveys so we can do exactly what Amy was mentioning in terms of really looking at across time the success of the various kinds of programs. So that's just something we should think about as we figure out what this first survey looks like.
And this is Stephanie Crable. I was thinking also too that we want to really be intentional on who our audience is. A couple of the surveys had a hugely broad audience, and some were more focused. So I wanted to make sure that we kind of honed in on that as well.
And this is Amy Feith. I second what Jackie is saying and sharing. In that resources subcommittee from day one, we really were thinking there are those there are several audiences, but at the time, given the climate in the community, we felt like the most important piece was the communication to the parents / public at large. And so we wanted to keep it a little higher superficial so that we could go ahead and convey some of that commitment to this Title IX committee had just formed, that this resources subcommittee was looking at tools that would be able to assist us in climate, et cetera. But the first thing we wanted to do was, most importantly, do people know where they go if they have any concerns? And of course, that was probably a year or more ago that we were just in the beginnings of that. And as Amy pointed out, we've got miles of stuff that we have put in place since then. But the whole point was we knew that the one survey was not going to be appropriate for the different developmental age levels. If we were focusing on input from students, which we should and need to do at some point, it was not going to be the same language that we would use for the parents and the general public. And then of course you have your staff, faculty, and your contractors that have also a very different perspective because of the fact that they work for the schools. So we were very aware from the beginning that this was, going to have to start someplace, start with a small survey that was going to be more of a broader based one, hoping that could give us a baseline that would then also give us some trends or ideas of where we would need to focus the efforts and resources next. So just to be clear, we were very aware out of the gate that we were, this was one part of a spectrum that was going to need to happen. And then of course, when Mr. Lewis came on board, that was something that he was and his office were going to want to measure on a regular basis too, once they got things cemented and gelled in his office as he implemented things. So.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. B. So it sounds like we're going ahead and getting into the discussion point. So I do have a set of points that I know we need to follow up on based on our previous discussions. And so we'll just go ahead and start with that based on where we already are currently. And that's about the audience for the survey. Mm-hmm. So we need to address and make a decision on who is our audience for this first initial release of a survey. whether it's students, parents, or community members. So that's our first question. Who is the audience of this survey? So based on Ms. Feith's information, sounds like we will have multiple individuals that we're trying to reach, but we need to start somewhere with this first release of the survey. So this first draft of the survey, what are everyone's thoughts regarding the audience? And we'll just popcorn this regarding who the audience individuals would be, whether it's students, parents, or whatnot, for the survey.
I think that goes back to what Ms. Craybill was saying, and we're talking about what is the goal. So what if we need to figure out the goal of the survey before you determine the audience.
That's what I was thinking.
Okay. Well, yeah. So the goal of the survey.
I'm sorry.
Who was talking?
I'm sorry.
You can go ahead.
Sorry, this is Stephanie Walker. I apologize. I just want to pipe in because I've been taking notes. Sometimes it takes me a little. I like to listen a lot because I like to hear what happened before we got here. And Amy Feith just made some good points, which I wrote down because initially, and then Jackie talked about climate. I think it seems to me that if we're trying to build, and I know Jackie talked about the, what was that phrase that we spoke about? Institutional betrayal or whatever. We really,
Right.
Yeah. I mean, maybe our audience should start at the higher level and be community based only because, and of course we're building upon it. A first survey that shows our intention is to find out what climate is and find out maybe what community feels. I mean, and community also includes others too. We've got levels here, looks like students, parents, community, but everybody sits underneath the community too. So my thoughts that I've written down are, first that we're going to build upon it. So later on we can add more things to it. And then community, climate, and then, make it a regular thing. Those are the things I kind of wrote down. So those are my thoughts, how everybody else feels about that.
I would say as a Title IX coordinator, I would look for the survey that is able to provide the most helpful information for me in my role as a Title IX coordinator. I think in that, I think a survey for student audiences first would be the most helpful for my role as Title IX coordinator to be able to address what's going on in the schools. And so I would even specify that even more and state that the audience, for me, I think at this time with the first release would be for sure high school students, and there can be some debate about middle school students, but definitely not elementary students at this current time. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, no,
Sorry,
sorry. Who was that? Sorry, is that Jackie?
Jackie.
Go ahead, Jackie. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm conflicted because I agree with Jarrell 100% that we really need to talk to the students as soon as possible. I also think that we need to have contact with the parents in some way. And so if we go back and look at some of the examples of the survey, probably the last two don't lend themselves to this, but maybe version 3, you could tweak the language a little bit so that we could ask questions of the students in terms of what they've actually experienced, but then ask some of the same kinds of questions of the parents in terms of, have you heard about, or are you aware of these kinds of instances? So maybe, and rather than pick just one audience, we could do parents and the students at the same time. Because parents have got to be an integral part of this process in terms of knowing what's going on with their students. And so we need to understand the extent to which the parents have trust in the system, and know what to do, but we also need to know what's really going on. So that's that's sort of a hybrid.
Yeah, that speaks to the trust component of it. And I think the only reason I thought about community climate first was based on what Amy was saying. But that now that we've come a couple more steps with a coordinator and now an investigator, which was, if I'm not mistaken, just got there in September, maybe it is time to delve into the student survey. And I guess I've seen so many drafts of surveys. I'm kind of blown away with the terminology, and I know that's going to come later on, what we decide, what wording is the best. That seems to be what was the most conflict with the last few surveys. And being new here, I'm confused at why it got changed, but that doesn't matter anymore now that we're here and we were determined to do a survey. I think we need to obviously look at what's appropriate. And I did a refresher on Jarrell's presentation to us as a board about things that were changed as far as what you can say or what you shouldn't say, what harassment is and what sexual harassment. And I think when we get down into the survey, like figuring out the most appropriate terminology, I think that's what the sticking point looks like it's going to be on the survey. So I do agree. I wasn't trying to say we shouldn't do one for the students. I absolutely believe that's necessary, but I'm just glad that we're establishing that it is necessary to do. And I hope we do agree on that.
I'll agree. And
Yeah.
this is
And so this question, we might not have the answer for it today, but it will be something that will be added to the, like I said, at the beginning, we'll do a simple majority for some of the points. So everyone can share their discussion points. And then at the end, once we get to the voting part of it, we'll send out that information. And the simple majority is how we determine what the answer is for the audience. But are there any more points about who the survey audience should be for this first initial survey?
Jarrell, I just had a question about if we're deciding to keep including middle school or high school, keep including or not including middle school because of the EYES survey. We do have some schools that aren't in EYES, so we would miss out on their feedback. So how would we go about capturing that, do you think?
Yeah, so I did make a point on here about avoiding redundancy. So there are a couple of other groups that are surveying our students. The EYES grant I think it's actually ending at the end of this academic year. And it was limited to, I think, 5 middle schools or so. So it's not a broad scope of students that were surveyed in middle school. But I did want to just make the point that that is something that is out there that our students have been surveyed about that does speak about bullying and harassment. But I don't think it would hurt to necessarily survey those students again, despite the EYES survey going on for the past number of academic years. And in addition to that, there's also another survey, the Safer Schools Task Force. Also, I think Dr. White has mentioned the survey before with the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System Survey. So there are individuals through the partnership under the Safe Schools Task Force that utilizing a survey from them as well. So I just want to avoid redundancy to let other individuals know that there are other surveys that are going on within our district as well. But I don't think they necessarily need to hinder us in our work with this survey.
Ms. Jordan, do you want to weigh in on that at all? No.
Sorry, I was trying to get my microphone off.
Okay.
In the back of my mind, my main concern is making sure that students are supported as they go through a survey. If they have a question that triggers them in some way, just making sure that students are aware of where they can get that support and making sure that we are mindful of that when we decide of the location that students are when they're actually surveyed. That's kind of what keeps on running through my mind, is making sure that the support is there.
Right, and I agree. I think it's very important that we add information, whether in an introduction or at the conclusion, of where students can get support resources through their local school or through central office. I think that's going to be really helpful to students to make sure that they're not feeling alone if they are triggered or some type of emotional response based on the questions that we ask. Any other discussion points about the audience of this survey? So far, I have information that we want to have this definitely for students and also for parents. So if not, then I'll add that to the list of questions to send out for voting purposes, and we'll go from there. Looks like we have a comment from Ms. Amy Feast. I agree, the hybrid surveys simultaneous for students and legal adult caregivers for where we are now. There's been a myriad of progressive implementations we've seen from our first survey job to where we are currently. Okay. Thank you, Ms. Feast.
Mm-hmm.
And so moving forward, the next conversation that we need or answer, the question we need to address is actually the scope of the survey. So far the survey has been named the Title IX survey because it's the work of the Title IX committee and the resources subcommittee. But I believe with the fourth and fifth versions, and maybe even the first through third, I think it's a bit misleading in regards to the behaviors that it is addressing. So of course, Title IX speaks to specifically sexual misconduct and gender discrimination. But there have been questions on some drafts that speak about just non-sexual and general conduct. So we can have a survey that addresses these things outside of sexual misconduct and gender discrimination. But I think we would need to address the title of the survey and maybe need to broaden our work because it's the Title IX committee that's very specific, but we're also looking at other areas of impact. So what are your thoughts regarding if this survey is specific to Title IX, sexual misconduct, gender discrimination, or do we broaden that out to just general harassment, discrimination, bullying?
And that's kind of where I was when I was talking about goals, is because there's two distinct differences between draft 1, 2, and 3, lump that into one, and then draft 4 and 5 that we've worked on, the lump that into one. There's two different approaches. One is more about overall climate, and one is more, well, and even draft 1, 2, and 3 that doesn't even really have mention of sexual misconduct in it at all. So if we were trying to get it, then draft 1, 2, and 3 didn't have those words. So that's, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. Draft 3 did have the words. Yeah, draft 3 did have the words. So yeah, so that is, again, I'm having a hard time figuring out the questions until we figure out what we really want our scope and goals to be to get to this. Like, what information are we trying to gather?
Well, I'm speaking of somebody who was on the Title IX committee and the resource committee and worked on those first 3 drafts. I thought our purpose was to specifically address sexual harassment issues. And so when I saw the versions 4 and 5, I really don't know what happened, how we went from one kind of configuration of questions to something that was totally different. And so if I had a vote, I go back and say, let's focus on the Title IX sexual harassment and bullying and be very specific about that. I mean, that's what the community, I think, is most concerned about. And that's just my opinion.
I agree with Jackie, because I feel like when we talked about it at the last regular school board meeting, that was the discussion was based around 2 different versions of a survey. And I didn't have the opportunity that time to see one of the drafts. I think the one that we saw on the school board were just talking about bullying and harassment, which it is part of what sexual harassment is, but it wasn't as specific. So when I'm looking at it, it's not saying to me that's what we're trying to do. And I think if we're going to be purposeful here as a Title IX committee, we should include some terminology that addresses that. I've seen different ways that people put it in the survey. So, but I agree with Jackie on that. That's my opinion.
Any other comments regarding the scope of the survey? So I think that if we did narrow the scope and limited it to sexual misconduct only, the Title IX policies have specific definitions: sexual assault, sexual harassment, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking on the basis of sex. So maybe that's an area where we pose our specific categories of behaviors based on the type of Title IX definitions in our policy. So that's something, if we do decide to go the route of narrowing it to sexual misconduct only, then we could mimic and address it based on the definitions under the current Title IX policies.
I found it very, very helpful in the samples of the surveys that you sent us from the OCR, from Palo Alto and the other school. And those surveys were dramatically different. And it was really the Palo Alto one that was focusing specifically on sexual harassment. And the other one didn't seem to be very helpful in that regard. So I thought that was useful for you to provide that so that we could see those 2 distinctly different kinds of surveys and the purposes that they were serving. And I think for our purposes, the Palo Alto one even though it's not a ORC's not telling us that it was a scientifically sound or valid survey. It certainly acknowledged the importance of using specific sexual harassment language.
Okay, thank you, Dr. White. And so, yes, I did include the Palo Alto survey and the Bernalillo survey. It's just some examples of what surveys can look like. There's not a ton floating around there in K-12 world that have been released by school districts. So I did my best to try to get some from colleagues. And Palo Alto School District had some incidents of sexual misconduct in their district, which led to OCR complaints, which led to them developing the survey as part of their resolution agreement with OCR. Same for the other survey with Bernalillo School District. But like Dr. White said, they do capture different pieces of information. So I would agree the Palo Alto survey might be our best model if we're looking at addressing the specific sexual misconduct pieces.
What I liked about it was the OCR was very specific in the directive to the school district that you need to explicitly define what you mean these terms to be, and they included the definition in the survey. And I thought that was a good model. And I think we actually did that in draft 3.
Thank you. Any other comments about the scope? Okay, so Amy Feast has a comment here. And so I'm just periodically checking comments as well. So Amy Feast's comment is, I think, given the issues and community feedback, we need to address the issues of sexual harassment specifically. We absolutely will also need to address gender identity, racial, ethnic, bullying, and I do think the community needs to see concrete resolution of sexual misconduct concerns and issues. Thank you, Ms. Feast. So moving forward with other points of discussion, talking about a time period. So of course, the history of New Hanover County Schools, there's been allegations from previous years. So when addressing and trying to get an understanding of what's going on in our schools, we need to decide if we are going to have a survey that just goes back into perpetuity, or if there's a survey that has a specific cutoff of incidents that we're trying to find or hear about. So some surveys, for example, might say, I think the Palo Alto does this, says like, for example, in the past 12 months, have you experienced XYZ? Is this something that we would want to include in our survey, or we would want to leave the time period out? Open to ideas and discussions on that point about it, limiting through a time period.
I'm kind of unclear on this, and maybe those of you that have been in the New Hanover County community longer than I have could comment on this. I got the impression that a lot of the concerns and complaints that were coming from people include individuals who have subsequently graduated from the New Hanover County high schools, but probably still feel a need to vent. And is this something that is appropriate to do? I don't know. I don't have a good sense of the climate out there, but I know in one of the early drafts, we did construct a survey so that former students would have the opportunity to report what had happened to them. I don't know. I'm mixed on this one.
So in the earlier draft, we did include a larger audience. I think it was parents and former students and former employees even. So we did include that information there. Going back to one of my goals of the survey, I want to have the most survey that's the most effective and helpful. I think the way we would be able to do that would be by providing a specific scope of information that we're looking for. For example, in the past 12 or 24 months, if we include that as a range of time on the survey, it would be helpful. And that can be our baseline for gauging in the future. As the individual said, this is not just a one-off thing. This is something that we want to do annually or every 2 years or something like that, to be able to see the growth over the course of time once we've had a longer period and outside of COVID opportunity to really see what our programming is doing in the schools here.
Do you think it would be beneficial to anyone, you jump in, be beneficial to just include our students, our current students first, then and see what we get back, and then as we're going into the second round of audience, to perhaps include former students, because that way, and I know people know that there are people that have been wronged, and we know that. So I'm just curious what anybody's thoughts are, starting with the audience of students, and that would go along with our time period, I would think, because if you're not a student, then you wouldn't get a survey at this juncture, because those two kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, I agree. I think if we were limiting it to individuals that are currently participating or in New Henry County Schools programs or activities, that would be beneficial. I also foresee, just thinking off the top of my head, if there were individuals that received a survey that were former students, just thinking of the accuracy and effectiveness of those surveys, logistically speaking, there would definitely have to be discussion of how do we ensure that the survey is accurate. Multiple people aren't providing multiple responses, or just accessing the survey to skew our data response and things like that. So those are some of the pieces that I'm thinking of logistically when we include individuals. This is kind of going back to the audience question, but when we include individuals that don't have an actual New Henry County Schools address, email address, that we could use to figure out who's as part of the survey audience.
Yeah, because I'm thinking the same thing about the validity of the data, that you would almost have to have two surveys, one for former students and provide your graduation year, and then one for regular students, because you have to keep that data separate, because otherwise we'd be out there chasing all kinds of things that we don't even know what we're chasing.
Stephanie Walker here. I tend to agree. I feel like if we're trying to, for the purposes of doing things that are current in our audience, and your purposes, Mr. Lewis, of doing your job, I think it probably would be better, like Stephanie Krevel said, like to have something separate if it was for former students, because I see the questions on here in one of the drafts, and I guess I wasn't there when they decided to put everybody in it. There must have been a reason, and maybe perhaps it was speaking to Amy Feith, saying kind of it's kind of more community, higher level. But I agree, for this purpose, maybe we should stick with current. My thoughts.
So I think that makes good sense. If you stick with current students, I'm sitting here thinking about, do you want to just do the past year or more than that? I mean, some surveys say since age 14, that wouldn't work, of course, for the middle school students, but I'm just trying to think about what kind of information would you want from a high school senior in contrast to a freshman, because something might not have happened during their senior year, but it happened in the junior year, and it's still a student in the program who is probably dealing with possibly dealing with the trauma of the assault. So I'm just thinking about a little bit more inclusive, that current students, but more inclusive.
Okay. And so going back to the question of time frame, Ms. Jennifer Vandermenden, one of the experts at UNCW, professors, stated in the comments that past 12 months is a common time frame for asking about victimization. It is difficult for most children to accurately remember beyond 1 year. So she believes that the question is whether you are trying to assess current climate or use this as a mechanism to gather data on specific cases current in the past. So I agree, and in my position, when we investigate cases, particularly involving younger children, we don't necessarily want to ask them when this occurred or try to give them or force them to provide us a timeline, because it's difficult for them to understand time, essentially. And so it might be easier, and we might get more accurate information if we limit it to the past 12 months. If we want to go a little bit further, maybe the last 24 months, but I think 12 months is common in surveys that I've seen. And Ms. Vandermanden agrees to the same point.
if we are trying to get to things that we've called systemic or institutionalizing, that kind of thing, is it possible to toss in a question that says something about that? Are you remembering, are you answering based on current, or are you answering based on past? I mean, is that worth even going to that level for the folks of you who are, do surveys all the time? Jen, go ahead. You can talk. We don't mind listening to you.
I'm trying to, yeah. So there's also this other, which maybe is arguably better way that some surveys ask about victimization. So you might say, did this ever happen to you? And then if they say yes, you say, did this happen in the last 12 months? So it's getting at that idea of if a 10th grader says, yes, this happened, and then you say, did this happen in the last 12 months? They can say yes, no, or I don't know. And they can identify that they don't know the time frame.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was thinking.
And then
Yeah,
if
so
somebody
better.
says, no, it didn't happen, then you don't ask about the time frame, so they don't have this really long survey. So it
Okay.
for students that don't disclose, but if they do, then you can follow up with a time frame.
Great, thank you.
I think
Yeah,
that's
That's good.
Yeah, and so we definitely can include multiple part questions with subparts. Not a problem that, we have to stick to one question only. So I think that's a good point. Thank you. Any other points regarding time frame that any others wanted to share? Okay, so we will continue on with the points that need to be decided.
Jarrell, take a quick peek at Amy's piece comment.
I'm sorry, I missed it. Let me see here. Looks like Amy Oots provided a comment.
No,
Oh, is it fees? Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Are there parameters the lawsuit lawyers would advise against? I believe that was part of the feedback where we were also concerned about, since seeking feedback or event information could impact discoverable evidence if there is a current case. So for me and our role as the Title IX committee, we're not concerned with the litigation. That's for the board to decide. The board members as a whole, once it comes out of the committee, that's for the board to decide, as they will have the final say regarding what comes out. So I think that we, as the work of the Title IX committee, can do our work without any concerns of litigation. It's not anything that I'm concerned about in my role. That's for the board to actually decide when they're determining if they want to release a survey and what that survey looks like. So again, this is just our work here is to provide a recommendation to the board as a whole that has the final say. So. But thank you for your question, Amy. So another question that
May I add one thing as we think about the time frame? That we can, as I thought Jen's suggestion made a lot of sense and is consistent with the literature. Has this ever happened to you? Was it in the last year? But I also think we need to make sure that they're not that it's happened since the age of 13 or 14 or something, because we do not want to inadvertently pick up old child abuse cases. That could get really confusing very quickly. And from the research that I've read, the experiences that adolescents have look a lot like the kinds of sexual harassment experiences even college students have. But we don't want to get down into what's happening before the age of 13 or 14, because then we really are going to get it mixed in with child abuse stuff. And I think we really want to make clear that that's not what we're looking at. And that could really complicate the picture in terms of understanding the school environment.
Yeah, and so I think that's a good point. We do have an expert from DSS that can speak a little bit about some of those child abuse reporting pieces. So Ms. Spivey, if you could hear us, can you just provide a little bit of information regarding reporting and the role of DSS when it comes to child abuse and interaction with the school system?
Yes, I'll be glad to. So what I would like for you guys to know today is that we are guided by North Carolina General Statute 7B, and it defines and guides North Carolina Child Protective Services. The alleged victim must be under the age of 18, and the perpetrator must be a caretaker, parent, or guardian. or custodian. So this includes like a step parent, foster parent, an adult member of the household that's entrusted with the care of the child. We don't investigate non-caretaker reports, but what we do is we make sure that those reports get to the proper authorities. So if a report gets called into us, we'll make that decision whether it's caretaker or non-caretaker. The caller does not have to worry about that. And if it's non-caretaker, we will ensure that it gets to the right law enforcement agency and the DA's office. So those are the items that we investigate, or those are the guidelines of our investigations. And also we have legal definitions of abuse, neglect, and dependency that have to be met as well. We have a 17-page screening tool, maltreatment screening tool, that my intake workers ask the reporter to get information to guide us in that intake process. So it's a very thorough process. And once we get that information, we'll make the decision whether it is for Department of Social Services to investigate, or for law enforcement, or for both of us together.
Thank you, Ms. Bybee. So 18 and so we're 17 or younger, I guess, is the age range that you all consider minor for your work in reporting, correct? 17
Yes.
and younger?
Yes, we investigate. The alleged victim must be under the age of 18 years old.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
And so
does that include age 18? Like if we have seniors that are 18?
No, it does not.
Okay.
Okay. And so that brings me to another point that I had as a goal. Open-ended questions and multiple choice questions. As I stated earlier, I think one of my goals is to have the most helpful survey, and by doing that we would include questions that are multiple choice only, closed-ended questions. Do we want to open the floor to discussions about open-ended questions versus closed questions?
I would like to suggest only multiple choice so that we can call the data and look at it pretty quickly, and then we can always figure out another way to get open-ended answers with our programming.
Open-ended questions are a bear to analyze, number one. And if you run the risk of people revealing more information than they should, which I think creates a whole lot of possible reporting complications. And it also could be that somebody just vents in some kind of a crazy way, and then the fact that they don't get some kind of a specific response to their comment could exacerbate their anger or frustration at the system even more. Open-ended questions are a can of worms.
Thank you, Dr. White. And so moving forward with survey discussion points, the method of survey release. So last time we discussed talking about why it had taken so long and the impact of COVID on the work of the Resources Subcommittee and the survey. So I want to open the floor to discussions about survey release and what that would look like, whether it's via email, whether the survey is provided in class and provided some time in class to actually answer the survey. What are some thoughts and ideas about the actual release of the survey to students?
Could someone I don't know, could say a little bit about how you typically survey students and from your experiences, what works best?
Julie, would you have information on previous surveys in the schools, or one of the Ms. Oots?
Hey, actually, hi everybody. Actually, I'm thinking that maybe Ms. Jordan, Tanya Jordan, can you share with us a little bit? I know that I can share that we have not had as much participation in surveys such as youth risk behavior surveys as we may have liked from the past, but certainly want to make sure we do more of that in the future. But Ms. Jordan, would you like to share from a counselor perspective?
Yeah, from a counselor perspective, thank you, Mrs. Varnum. My thought process in thinking about surveying is, now we're in a unique situation where we have some students who are remote and some who are face-to-face. So being mindful of, I personally would prefer to see students being surveyed when they're on their in-person days so that we have supports in the building for them if need be. I think that just gives us an opportunity to have counselors and social workers to support them.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Jordan.
And I would echo in on that too, for that reason, but also so that we know that the student perhaps is completing their own survey and aren't getting the help of a sibling or a friend or a parent that may not have the same insight, perception, experience that the child is having. So that would make it a little bit easier, because we can do it in hybrid, whatever day you're in. If we do get back into plan A, then certainly we have more options, to do that.
I agree. It probably also lends to the students having more opportunity to be more transparent with their responses by not having to do it when maybe mom or dad are, right there looking. We want to make sure that children have the opportunity to express themselves as they desire.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of that, can I ask the question? I saw somebody type in opt in, opt out. Does it have to have permission from their parents to take the survey, or somebody that doesn't know the answer to that? Or
So
can they just take it? Sorry.
That was one of the discussion points that we had previously.
Yeah, I can add in on that. That's actually one of the policy discussions going on right now, and it's really usually based on the type of questions. So generally, with questions like a youth risk behavior survey, which you're really asking about a child's involvement with either higher risk or higher confidentiality, situations with higher confidentiality, we do typically err on opt in, but I think it's worth discussing, because we know that we need a good database. We need to make sure that we can express the comfort level, and many times we have situations where folks don't respond to paperwork necessarily. They didn't mean not to ignore the opt-in. And so we don't have a good database or data source or sampling because of that. So I think it's worth a good discussion, but I think that discussion needs to include that this is highly sensitive information. And there are going to be many parents that don't want their kids to participate in something that might be considered re-traumatizing without them having an opportunity to say that they'll be completing it.
Julie, I know in the past, when we did this research project about 10 years ago with HOPS, which was healthier options for public school students, where we were collecting BMI information, and that kind of stuff, but only really to use for statistical purposes, not to nag a child because they were under or over their recommended BMI. And what we did with parents there was we used had a parent night, where the principal and the lead people, or through the PTA council, we talked to them about what the survey was, and told the parents basically what we were asking, so that they could, just like you do with the family life curriculum, you get to go in there, you get to look at it and see, do I want to do this or not do that? So that might be a way to not get around, but to address that kind of issue.
I thought we had a discussion of this at one of the Title IX committee meetings, and we had come to the conclusion that we would just let the parents know about the survey, but give it to all the kids unless a parent specifically opted their kid out. Am I remembering that correctly? That we made that decision?
We did have a conversation previously. I'm sure it was over a year ago. Opt-in versus opt-out, and I think the consensus was opt out would be the best approach, because that would allow us to have a broader response. But then there were questions of how do we go about that through board policy. So that's where we would have to revisit. So I don't think the issue is whether the Title IX committee or resources subcommittee prefers opt-in or opt-out. I think the answer was even the committee itself preferred the opt-out option. It was, can we do it? So that was a discussion point for us to talk about today as a resources subcommittee, but it was just to double check and make sure that that was still the preference. And so I'll still also add that as a question for voting purposes, but I do think the consensus previously was that it was opt-out. The question was, how do we go about doing that through New Hampshire County Schools policy? Because we can't just survey minors, all any way we see fit. So there would be some limitations that we'd have to address first and foremost.
Yeah, and I'll just add in that I think it would be appropriate for the committee to recommend an opt-out so that we have a better data response, but then allow, that has to go on to the board for determination based on how that policy is going to roll out. Because even as the survey that Ms. Craybill is mentioning from several years ago, when it came back through the board about 5 or 6 years ago, the board determined that it would not be an opt-out, that would be an opt-in, specifically because it was asking questions about BMI. And so I do think that, as boards evolve and change, there's a different perspective. That's just the last thought that was on that. So I think, again, I'm comfortable with an opt-out as long as we do exactly what you're talking about, Ms. Craybill, where we do that parent information like we do with other sensitive subjects. Let's have that parent information. Let's give parents plenty of opportunity to understand, ask questions, who they need to reach out to, and give them plenty of opportunity to understand exactly what we'll be asking. But then let's, really push for the opt-out.
And to clarify my response about children being able to be transparent, I guess I was kind of thinking more about the survey goals that we went over earlier, and about being able to be kind of an opportunity for immediate help. And I just think it's so important that if a child does need help, that they get the help that they need. Not necessarily about making sure that we want parents, of course, to know what their children are, what's going on with their children, but also making sure that every child has the opportunity to have a voice heard in something so important.
Absolutely agree.
Okay, so we're getting close to the end of all the survey discussion points that I had for today.
Amy Oots just had a comment. Yeah, and then, it is an anonymous survey, Amy, but here's what I'm understanding, and Drell, jump in, is that we would just give them the resources so that if they wanted to get the help or they felt they needed it right away, then it's right there in front of them. They don't have to go home and think about it and worry about it. They can go straight to their counselor or straight to their, that's what that meant, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to reach out to a person specifically because we don't know. It's anonymous. You're right.
Well, I would be hesitant to use the word anonymous because depending on the method of release, it's hard to 100% promise that anything can be anonymous. Of course, we are a public entity, as New Hampshire County Schools is. There are record requests and things like that. So getting into the legalistic technical points, it's difficult to absolutely promise an anonymous survey. I think what we can promise is privacy. And so being an anonymous survey would mean we're not able to pinpoint exactly who the survey came from or who provided this response. I think it's not safe to say that we can promise that, but what we can promise is that if we are able to pinpoint who the survey came from, we would not share that information out with individuals beyond who need to know to help resolve or respond. So that might be a technical caveat, but I don't want to give the false sense of anonymity for the survey. And I think it's difficult to promise that.
So even if the students are taking the survey in school, they're still doing it online? Is that what you're talking about? So you might be able to trace it back through their IP address?
Well, because we haven't finalized how it will be released, whether it's, in person on A to AB days, or if we're back 100% plan A, it depends. But if it is released remotely, for sure, I think there could be difficulty, particularly remotely, through student emails. There's definitely going to be difficulty in promising an anonymous survey. That's why it's going to be important that we also have points in there that, you know, this is not a reporting tool, if that's the direction that we go, and things such as that. So it just depends on the method of release.
Yeah, I'm no technological savvy, but I mean, I've even done longitudinal research where we did things online. And so we were able to connect responses to the same person across time, but we filled in all these layers of sort of buffers so that it literally would have been impossible to connect even a string of responses to a specific individual. And am I naive to think that you can't hide or protect or delete an IP address as soon as the data go into a data file, that somehow it gets erased?
I am definitely not the one to answer that question.
I don't know either, but
we'll have to use our partners in the technology unless someone else here has some information that they can share.
I'll just mention that earlier when we had discussed this, we had our Assistant Superintendent for Technology, Dawn Brinson, on with us, and her really her understanding is that, you know, we can have a structure that most individuals can't, you know, tamper through and you know, decipher the identity. But there are certainly folks that can, and you know, hacking for some, it's just not that difficult. And, you know, even a very secure system has the opportunity for somebody with some skills to be able to dig in and find information. So I think that's why we were leaning on we're going to aim for completely confidential and anonymous, and we are not going to be tracking, but we don't want to give some kind of false sense of security that that it's absolutely untraceable. We would want it to be untraceable.
Yeah, I was just going to say some of the drafts of these surveys actually say your confidentiality is a priority, and whatever information you shared in the survey cannot be identified. We cannot access your IP address or link your survey to your name, student ID, or email address. I mean, if that still pertains, would we keep that in the survey? Is that still true?
So that was a previous survey. If you look at the draft number 5, that third paragraph on that.
The last one.
The last one with the third paragraph was removed for that particular reason.
Okay. So that was removed because you could not promise the complete anonymity. Okay. I was just making sure. I guess I don't have that one in front of me. I've got lots though.
Well, it's the same as draft 4, Steph, except that it doesn't have paragraph 3.
That's the only difference.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's actually the same as all the drafts, except doesn't have paragraph 3.
I've got like 3 of them that have that. So it's probably, you're right. It's probably on 4 and probably 5.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a clarifying question, which maybe I should have asked during scope. The first question is, it's a little unclear in the last draft if this is all about in school, if this is like every experience that we're asking about in the survey is about in school, which I think it is from our conversation. Okay, there's also questions in there about perpetrating, about sort of doing this to others. And if you're not saying that this is anonymous, is there any risk there with students disclosing that they've actually been engaging in bullying behavior, or they've been sexually harassing others, with disclosing not just a victimization, but also a perpetration? And if it was intentional to ask about both being a victim and also, and a perpetrator is not the best word there, but, engaging in that activity.
So I think that's a good point. And there's still some discussion about who's are we including bystanders as well? Are we wanting to speak to only individuals that have been impacted? And so I think those are still points that we have left to discuss when we're getting to the actual drafting or revisiting the actual questions. But if we want to have that as a point right now, we can definitely have the discussion. Are we trying to address behaviors specifically in school? Do we want to make that clear? Or are we keeping it up to let the students interpret it however they see fit?
I would go back to the audience and the time period discussion that we had and say school, because that's that's really what we as a school system can impact. And then if we were to see any trends, then we could reach out to our community partners and help us address things in the community perhaps. But yeah, I think that Stephanie Craybill, personal opinion, I think we should limit it to the scope of what has happened to you in school, on a school activity, on a school bus, at a sport event, those kind of things.
I agree.
So, this discussion goes on a lot for especially older adolescents. Some of these experiences are going to be happening. They're committed by other students, but it's not necessarily at a sanctioned school function. So it's like in a dating context. And I think you want to include those because you have to be concerned about the victim and the offender being in the same classroom, and there's all kinds of implications for the well-being of the students. And so I wouldn't want to exclude those off-campus social activities when other students are involved. So I think that's one thing we should consider.
Jackie,
I'm
sorry, go ahead, Joe.
You can go ahead, Ms. Walker.
Well, no, is it safe to assume that we could have a question in there, or that doesn't necessarily just like we want to aim it for school and school activities, as broad as that kind of sounds, but also, I mean, if it's a student, couldn't you have a question in there that kind of asks that? Would it cover that?
Yeah, and that's what Jennifer Tucker just stuck into the chat is, can there be a question on the survey about feeling safe in school and in your classes? So we could still get to that point and keep it school related. Maybe not school. Well, that is school related,
And so the point I was going to make, since it's Title IX survey, under Title IX for sexual harassment, sex discrimination issues, the scope of Title IX is within the program or activity of New Hanover County Schools. So for example, if a sexual harassment, sexual misconduct incident occurs between two students of New Hanover County Schools on a Saturday unrelated to New Hanover County Schools, that is conduct that we cannot address through our Title IX policies and procedures through the federal government. So if we want to keep in line with what Title IX policy says, that's just a point.
Well, that's an important point. Yeah. Okay.
Well, so I mean, how do you deal with the issue of a student if they have been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted on a Saturday night date, and then they go to school on Monday morning and the students are in the same classroom? The student no longer feels safe at school.
Right.
And so
that's what I was going to say.
And so what we would do from a Title IX perspective is we would provide what we call supportive measures, things that we can do to support the students, whether it's classroom change of one or either student, or stay away agreement, or anything, counseling, extra time on schoolwork to make the environment most comfortable. Really, it's case by case. But from the specific of addressing through the Title IX policies, those off-campus behaviors unrelated to school, we definitely cannot address through the Title IX policies and procedures. If there was some outgrowth of the initial incident that did occur on campus within our programs or activities, that's sexual in nature, then we could address that through our conduct.
It is important to have a follow-up question to determine whether it happened within the context of a school event or not, because based on the research that I know, for many adolescents, a lot of the experiences are not happening in the context of a school function, but it's going to have an impact on their well-being and comfort at school, which I think you still want to know about. So you should be able, because if you find out that most of these things are happening not at school functions, it's going to very much change the kinds of support services you offer students, I would think.
Yeah, and so Jenna Young said, I would agree that even if sexual misconduct occurs outside of school, still affects school climate. And I think that's why we probably didn't actually address this one specific question, because I think we assumed that we would just, take all of that and leave it up to student interpretation. But we could definitely, do some drop-down questions if we want to narrow the actual information regarding where it came from.
Especially if we go with wording that says, have you been impacted? Because impacted, your classroom, you're impacted in your classroom, even though it happened off. So that would just be, we could define what impacted means, to a student and as a drop down. Does that sound like right, Tanya, for like in a school environment?
Yes, I totally agree.
Can I say something about the question about asking about whether or not somebody has engaged in the offending behaviors, been a perpetrator or an offender? Yeah, I have mixed feelings about that because as a researcher, if you're gonna truly prevent this stuff, you have to focus on who's perpetrating, and studying only victims is not adequate. One of the things that I've found in doing all this work, this is more at a college level, that these questions are so general that even if somebody says, yeah, I've bullied, yes, I've sexually harassed, it's such a vague response that yes, I did it, that it has there's not enough information there for any kind of criminal liability, or there's nothing really to investigate. So in that sense, it's sort of safe to ask the question. It's just
right.
It's partly an issue of how long you want the survey to be. And some people, when they just feel like surveys are too long, if you ask about being both victimized and perpetrating, people opt to ask just about the victimization experiences, which, then you're losing out, but you're also gaining a shorter survey. It's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and to that point, Jackie, if we do ask some questions about the perpetrator, then that will change our whole program. That would lead us on another line of programming. I mean, if kids are saying, yeah, I've done this,
Yeah.
and everybody says I'm doing this, then we know, well, maybe we need our counselors to have a lesson, or we need teachers to do some, maybe there needs to be some other intervention, kind of strategy, not intervention, but prevention kind of strategy.
It's not true prevention if you're not focusing on the offender.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. All of our programs are primary prevention, which is preventing perpetration.
Yeah. Thanks, Jenna.
Okay, and so let me just go through the comments here, make sure we didn't miss any others. Wouldn't you have to rely, this is from Jen Tucker, wouldn't you have to rely on reporting to know who needs these supportive measures as opposed to a survey? And so I think that was the only point there. Jen, did we answer your question based on the discussion just now? You can put yes or no, or do we need to follow up? Okay, thank you. And so moving forward, we're going to be out of here at 4:30. Our next Title IX committee meeting is on the 15th, and we will report back potentially about what's discussed here, but it sounds like we might need to have a second discussion with the Resources Committee because we will be wrapping up at 4:30.
Do we have enough information on our discussion so far to at least try and figure out which of these, like when you gave A or B, A or B, A or B, do we have time to do that, or do we have enough information? Does anybody think they're ready to just make some generic, let's move forward kind of decisions?
I think we can, at least on the higher level, because I think we've spoken about a few things that I think we all are in agreement with for the survey.
So the question I would have is, out of the 5 drafts, which ones are individuals favoring for us to start the work moving forward? Is that where you were going?
No, where I was going was, you gave us audience, scope, time period, open-ended versus multiple choice, method, and I wrote impact. Oh, and opt-in. Yeah. Well, so aren't we ready to just at least pick A or B of each of those topics, and then when we actually get to a survey, then that's where our thinking is? I mean, does anybody feel like we're ready to do that? Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of head bobs.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
I think so.
Okay. Well, yeah. So you want to just start on your list? I mean, I wrote them down in the order that you talked about them, but
so the first one I had on my list was the audience, students or parents, who the audience was. It sounds to me that the consensus is that we definitely want to have the audience be students. So students or parents or students and others, I guess it's an either or. students only or students and others for the audience?
Let's pick one and then so yes or no.
Okay.
Otherwise, you don't know what we're raising our hand for.
Okay,
I say
so
students.
Okay. Yeah, all right. So how do we vote? I mean, do we like do thumbs up or do we do it?
and so what I was going to do is just send out another survey like we did to figure out with these particular 7.
Oh, okay. You want to do it on,
Okay.
in the Google
I
Sheet?
would be able to show the actual data for the
Okay.
response.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay.
But I mean, that takes longer if we want to go the quickest route.
Well, I just wanted to get something done so that we can come out of this meeting with some concrete stuff. And in case anybody's asked, we didn't sit here and twiddle our thumbs or, whatever.
Yeah.
We made some concrete movement, not concrete movement, some good progress, sorry,
Yeah.
in some direction.
Yeah,
Mhm.
so my next step was going to be we released a survey on Monday with addressing these questions, the 8 questions that we have here. I have 7, and we vote like we did for determining the date of the meeting, and then I'll show that graphs and information.
Okay, that shouldn't take us too long, right?
No, I think if it's quicker individuals, it's only 7 individuals, I think.
Yeah.
As long as the quicker we get those responses, the quicker we can share that out. We can have those answers. I think we
Okay.
can do that before the 15th, probably.
May I ask a quick question?
Yes, ask.
I'd still like for somebody who is a more knowledgeable member of this committee.
Can't hear you.
Can't hear you,
Yes,
Amy.
your mic went out, Ms. Hoops.
I was wondering if somebody could just summarize for me and maybe others, I don't know, what is the clear goal of this survey? Like, what is our goal?
We
And
still
then
haven't done that.
what are we going to, well, I heard several goals. And there may be several goals, but
I think there are, and that's why we
Okay.
need to vote and make the decision. Once we have those votes in, then that will be the answer to what the goal is.
okay.
But yeah,
Okay.
we were just
And then
discussing what some of them were.
the second part of my question is, do we have a plan for what we are going to do with the results of the survey?
Yeah, and so that was my final
That's
point
next,
of discussion. The results. What do we do? I was going to parking lot that because I don't think that we have time to really dive into that, and that might be a discussion for the actual. Since this recommendation will come from the Title IX committee to the board, that might not be for the resources committee to actually discuss. Since we're just actually providing the recommendation on the survey, the results that come back, that might be a committee discussion as a whole, or even a board discussion for what happens with those results. I don't think it's necessarily the resources committee that makes that determination, but I did think about that as well.
And that's a great point. I appreciate you making that. That helps clarify for me. And for me, I'm not sure whether it's the cart or the horse or the horse or the cart. So that's what I'm trying to figure out as in listening to that discussion.
Yeah, I think that would be a decision made above this subcommittee currently. Yeah.
Because really all this subcommittee, not all, it is very important. This subcommittee is tasked with presenting a survey to the whole Title IX committee so that we can approve it and recommend it to the board. And don't make me recommend something to me because you know what that will be, but teasing. But that's kind of where we are. Yeah.
I agree. And so for time purposes, are there any other points I have regarding things that we need to decide? So the question that will be on this quick survey that I send out early next week, who the audience is, whether this survey focuses on sexual or just general harassment and discrimination, the time period for behavior that we're trying to capture, the release, the method of the survey in person or remotely, opt-in versus opt-out. Are we trying to address behaviors in school or outside of school? And do we want to include question about the perpetrators as well? Is that consistent with what you have, Ms. Crable, and everyone else?
And the only other one I had in there was open-ended versus multiple choice. But I think didn't we all agree that we do not want open-ended?
Yeah, that's why I did include it.
Okay, so let's agree to that right now and just strike that one off of our to-do list. Yay, we got one done.
So what we will do is I will send a survey out like similar to one we sent out for determining appropriate time. And then hopefully we can have that done and submitted. The quicker everyone can respond, the quicker we can get that back. And we can, do we think it would be appropriate to share these results at the 15th, or do we want to?
I think we should be able to share them at the 15th, don't you think? Yeah.
I mean, like I say, it's yeah.
Because it's a step. I mean, it's everybody knows we're working, because that meeting will be one where we'll probably have more people watching us. And so we can talk with confidence that this is what our group, this is the direction we're going, and our survey will be coming as soon as we can now get the questions right. Yeah.
Right.
So once we have
I
these
agree.
goals in mind, then we'll be able to pinpoint the actual wording of questions and things like that moving forward. So then that's all that I have for today, everyone. I definitely appreciate your time. I think this is very, very
Thank you.
productive. Thank you,
Great
everyone.
work,
Thank you for
everyone.
Thank you all of our
experts.
SMEs for showing up.
Yes,
Appreciate
thank you.
All right. Well, if there's nothing else, then I will go ahead and end this meeting.
Okay, bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Mr. Lewis.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Jackie. Thank you, everyone.